Ofentse, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Now, Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula has been adamant going ahead with this Lekgotla, even though the National Taxi Alliance has said they won't be giving their stamp of approval. The ministers say, well, that's their risk. We're going to go ahead and have conversations and make decisions that will be without your input as the NTA. How dangerous is that from the Transport Ministry's point of view to go ahead with this Lekgotla without a major player like the NTA involved?
Interesting question, and good morning to yourselves and our viewers. I think the most important thing that we have to understand is what a Lekgotla is for. It is a platform for these grievances to be raised. It is a platform for very difficult engagement, and it is a platform to find consensus. Now, we have a history in the South African context where, the South African National Taxi Council was initially, an establishment that would represent the taxi industry with a constitution. And, the National Taxi Alliance, it represents what you'd say somewhat like a faction in that kind of discourse. But the challenge here is that in the process of formulating a reformed taxi industry, it is extremely essential to retain the level of unity. And by the way, not so long ago at the Portfolio Committee for Transport, the ministry did indicate that they do recognize the National Taxi Alliance. And the grievance probably could come from, the type of recognition that they're receiving, because the South African National Taxi Council is receiving a significant support. And the challenge here is that if the National Taxi Alliance is for a government program or against a government program, the state's initiatives tend to sway with the favor or the lack thereof. So even Santaco itself might not necessarily be able to retain the focus of the state. And that's a problem, because what you want is a consistent degree of focus for whoever is involved in this discourse.
Now, the minister has said that this is all part and parcel of government wanting to formalize the taxi industry. And whenever we've heard that statement before, there have been players within the taxi industry that have put their hands up and say, hang on. What do you mean by formalizing the taxi industry? Where does the industry fit into other public transport and non-motorized modes that are formalized right now?
Well, we have to ask, the primary question. Can you wake up tomorrow morning and start operating a taxi, picking up passengers and taking money? No. And there's a reason for that, because you need an operating license. You need to basically have a clearance certificate. You also need to you also need to comply with the labor regulations here in this country. And that is drafted, it's on paper. However, the challenge is that there's a significant lack of enforcement. And you saw the case in KZN where there were some officials that were basically selling operating licenses. And in fact, there's a large share of the industry that is operating nearly illegally. And that's where the real challenge is. So when we talk about formalization, it usually refers to those entities and those operators that are not formally part of the industry. But what we're really implying, what we're trying to say, is the industry needs to be professionalized, and it also needs to be reformed. And those are very, very different and very interrelated terminologies. And yes, it's semantics, but it's important, because formalization means that the industry is informal and now it needs to be formalized. But professionalization means we recognize the way in which the industry works, and now we want it to follow a professional type of structure that's in line with the interests of that particular industry. So, and reform would then imply changes in legislation, investment, and management structure. And that also implies a change in the way Santaco does business.
Now, a professionalization, of course, would also mean taking on competition. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a stigma around the taxi industry that whenever there's some kind of competition for the business that they have or for their clientele, they don't really take it very well. Or you can only look at when ride-hailing apps became popular, when the Gautrain started operating. There were all kinds of incidents in which taxi drivers or the taxi owners made their voices heard about being unhappy with having to compete with better services or safer services and sometimes even cheaper services as well. Do you think we'll ever see the day when the taxi industry takes on board their need to have a healthier relationship with these other modes of transport? And how important would that be for their own survival and this move towards professionalization?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because when we think, the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the taxi industry is destructive competition from even internally. They genuinely destructive competition. So, chasing for passengers, competing even among themselves for route dominance. So that is part of the manner in which the labor in the industry is incentivized to operate. So the bargaining council that you expect actually doesn't exist in terms of, securing the quality of labor regulations and compliance. And so the incentive is extreme in terms of, pushing the operators to be very sensitive to any new entrant in the market. So now with that level of sensitivity, a new mode presents a challenge, and that challenge needs to be confronted. And it depends on the stage and the location and the area that we're dealing with. But at the forefront of the issue is for modal integration to take place, the playing field needs to be level on an institutional level. I'll give you a simple example. So between, I think, 2013 and 2017, we've spent almost 133 billion rand on public transport subsidies. And really a very small share of that went to the minibus taxi industry, and that is through taxi recapitalization. And what happened was we had to move from recapitalization to transformation, or what you'd say formalization, and that was through the bus rapid transit systems. And many of the BRTs that we have today are operated by former taxi operators, and that's what it was for. It was only part of a smaller strategy that also included non-motorized transport. And then you'd have feeder routes from operators that don't have the viable volumes to be converted into buses. And that's where we are at the moment. So there is an opportunity for modal integration. There is an opportunity to interact, especially with Metro Rail, but there's a lot of municipal intervention that's required.
And now, just in closing, Ofentse, I mean, we've been talking so much about Transport Ministry and the taxi industry, but at the core and the heart and soul of this entire story are ordinary South Africans that depend on them to get to and from work on a transport system, of course, that's still battling the legacy and urban planning of apartheid as well. Where does it leave our ordinary South Africans that need this transport every given day? Because so many of them travel with the taxi industry, does this mean that the taxi industry will always have that kind of power and leverage to force their hand with government?
And that's a fascinating question, because the first thing that we must acknowledge is that for the first time we have both the ministry and the presidency making a formal statement that the industry is part and parcel of our economy. That's the first thing that we have to, acknowledge. The second thing is that commuters are waiting for a service that is not going to be easy to achieve, a service level that's not going to be easy to achieve. And it's not an institutional, it's not a political issue. It is an institutional issue. It has to do with the points where service delivery takes place, and that is in our municipalities. So the question at the end of the Lekgotla needs to be, what will the municipalities be doing differently from now onwards? I understand what will be different with the taxi industry. That's one thing. But how will the industry be able to interact with the municipalities where the taxi associations are. And that is a crucial point of departure, because if we're going to have another strike in Alexandra or in Mokopong, we have to be aware that the municipalities are equipped and ready to engage with the industry, set fair prices, and provide affordable and integrated public transport for everyone.
Thank you so much. Fascinating insights there. That's Transport Economist Ofentse Mokwena.